Hello everybody, my name is Carmen Martínez and today I want to introduce myself and talk a little bit more about my research project in PersonalizeAF. To know a little bit more about myself, I'm from a not so small city called Zaragoza in Spain, and when I was 18 I decided to move to Valencia to do the Bachelor of Medical Engineering, in which I had the opportunity during the last semester to go to Fachhochschule Joanneum in Graz in Austria to do the bachelor thesis. Later, after that experience, I felt like it was time to come back home. So I joined the Master in Biomedical Engineering University of Zaragoza, in which I was aware that it was a biosignal processing group that I was interested in. So at the end, I did the summer internship with them, the master thesis, and I was also working for a year using speed signals and hardware variability features in the present diagnosis. But right now, I'm based in Karlsruhe in Germany. I'm doing the PhD in the Karlsruhe Institute for Technology, and my PhD thesis is titled Impedance Characterization for Scar and Fibrosis Detection. My main supervisor is Professor Olaf Dussel, and I'm also under the co-supervision of Lluís Mont and Rémi Dubois in Barcelona and Bordeaux, respectively. So my project is part of the working package number 1, which is related to technologies for actual state and characterization. And it relies on the previous hypothesis that regions of scar and fibrosis can be a target for arrhythmias. So nowadays, these regions are characterized mainly by magnetic resonance imaging, but this technique is very expensive. It needs more than one appointment due to a time delay of the gadolinium, and it's also very time consuming. So it would be also possible to use impedance measurements in order to create an impedance mapping catheter system for atrial fibrosis quantification and also avoid the MRI, but not only for logistical reasons, but also for economic and healthy issues. Nowadays, voltage maps are widely more used. However, the voltage map is patient and time dependent because it not always reflects the substrate because it changes from time to time. Impedance could also help with that because it points directly to the polarization wave. And these impedance measurements could also be implemented in intracavitary recordings and help in detecting the atrial substrate that promotes not only the onset, but also the maintenance of atrial fibrillation. In order to assess that, currently we're using 3 different approaches. Clinical measurements of local impedance in ablation procedures, in silico simulations using catheters and tissue modeling, for knowing how the different factors contribute to impedance measurements, and in vitro experimentations to support both clinical and simulated studies. Starting with the clinical applications, the basic applications of impedance mapping is during the ablation procedure. Here in the left, we have a real clinical picture that we can see, where we can see the impedance values in the atrium. And with impedance measurements, we can be sure that the ablation line is performed without gaps, as we can work without the previous time that we mentioned about the gadolinium. On the other side, in the right hand, we can see how between the first and the second procedure, there was a scar line, which means that at the beginning, it's easy to think that the pulmonary vein insulation has been well performed, but however, sometime later, a gap is created and the line is not closed, which could be easily fixed with impedance measurements. Regarding the simulations, we are working in the setup of a 3D model of the MiFi catheter from Boston Scientific. This catheter in particular has 3 ring electrodes, distal, mid, and proximal. Instead of injecting the current between the ring electrodes, we inject the current between the proximal one and one of the mini electrodes, being able to measure the impedance between the distal electrode and the tip. So, given different conductivity values to the different parts of the catheter, we can set conductive parts of the ring electrodes of the mini electrodes and isolator parts of the ring between the ring electrodes and the isolator parts of the mini electrodes. The goal is to be able to use this model for performing in silico simulations in order to detect which factors can affect the real performance of impedance measurements. So at the same time as in silico experiments, we can double check in the AP lab what really happens. For that, we perform in vitro experiments in order to detect how the impedance changes when we modify different factors, as can be the catheter tissue distance, the angle of contact, even the type of tissue, the proper flushing that the catheter can introduce, or even the concentration of the surrounding medium, which usually is blood but can be slightly modified during the performance. And finally, talking about the future secondments, I'm planning to move to Bordeaux for 2 months after the Atrial Signals Conference in Glasgow in September. And later on, in spring 2022, I will spend 2 months in Barcelona. And although it's not determined yet, Boston Scientific has already a new catheter under investigation. So the plan will include 3 months in Boston, working with them by the end of next year, 2022. That's all from my side. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that you have liked this review of my project. Goodbye.